That's one of the most important topics of our time, the question of language and how it's used in an incredibly dishonest way, often to shut people down or to demonize people as being beyond the pale and not worthy of listening to, or not worthy of giving a platform to. If you look at the discussion of violence, as you say, it's got to a really bizarre level at the moment, where we are told that certain words are violence. Silence is violence, by which they mean if you don't nod along to everything Black Lives Matter says, you're racist, you're violent. So silence is violence. But then apparently real violence is not always violence.
Okay, I'm joined today by Brendan O'Neill. Brendan is the editor of the online magazine Spiked and the host of The Brendan O'Neill Show, which is a popular political podcast. He has had articles published in too many publications to list, regularly appears on the TV and the radio, and is generally one of the best-known political commentators and journalists in the UK today. Brendan, thanks very much for joining me on the E2 Review podcast.
Hi, Max. How's it going?
Very well, thanks. So let's get straight into it, because I know you're slightly limited for time. You've been described as one of the world's fiercest critics of groupthink. On this show, I basically try and call out what I see as the unthinking groupthink around me. And that's something which, obviously, having read your work for years, I can test that you're very good at doing yourself, probably much better than I am. So something which you've particularly focused on in your work and in your writing has been a kind of groupthink on the progressive side of the political spectrum, and that kind of liberal progressive politics more generally. So could you kind of get a summary of what it is which you take issue with that worldview?
Yeah, so I think the progressive wing of politics has just lost its way really, really badly. And that's why I criticize them so much. People say I'm anti-left or I'm a left basher, but I criticize that side of politics because I think they have just lost their direction in a really tragic way. The left and the progressive wing of politics just doesn't resemble what it used to be and what it was founded to do. It's turned against all its own principles. For example, increasing human freedom, that was one of the key principles of radicals in the past. Increasing individual autonomy, increasing democracy and the power of ordinary people. These were really the reasons that the left and the progressive wing of politics were founded in the first place, to give a voice to people who previously did not have a voice in the political sphere. And in order to have a voice, you need freedom of speech and you need democracy. And the left today, sadly, has turned against both of those things. And it's going down the politically correct road of wanting to clamp down on offensive ideas and silence offensive speakers. And it's gone down the anti-democratic road of trusting technocrats in the European Union more than it trusts ordinary people in the UK to decide what is best for this country. So on those two fronts in particular, which I think are the two most important fronts in politics, freedom and democracy, the left has betrayed all its principles and has become beholden to groupthink in relation to the dangers of freedom of speech, the importance of protecting people from offense, the importance of identity politics over the old value of universalism. But this is the new groupthink amongst the left, and I think it is a very regressive form of politics.
So taking, let's say, identity politics to begin with, what would be some of your main criticisms of that way of thinking about the world?
Oh, I really have, I guess, two criticisms of identity politics. The first is that it's very divisive. So it encourages us to see ourselves as identities, as basically our inherited traits. You're black or you're white or you're a Muslim, you're a gay person, you're a trans person. It encourages us to see ourselves in terms of things that are largely unchangeable. Of course, you can stop being a Muslim if you want to, so that's a slightly different situation. But it encourages us to see ourselves in relation to things that are largely unchangeable, which are largely just about the self, the individual. It's very navel gazing, rather than about our role in society, what we can do as individuals, what we could contribute to collective ideas, collective struggles, and those kinds of arguments that the left would have pushed in the past. So it's very divisive, it's very individuating. and it pits communities against each other. It explicitly does that. So it explicitly says white people are privileged and black people are oppressed. So therefore, these are, irreparably opposed groups. One of their interests override the interests of the other. And I think that is a very destructive way to understand the relationships between different groups in society. And so the first thing is it's very divisive. The second thing is, the second problem with it is the role of victim culture and the way in which it openly encourages people to see themselves as victims of oppression, victims of other people and their ignorance, victims of mainstream society and its prejudices. It whips up this grievance culture, this culture in which people are encouraged to understand themselves as victims of circumstance or victims of history rather than as the authors of their own destiny. And what that does, it gives rise to a political sphere in which people are implicitly encouraged to advertise their weaknesses and their suffering rather than their ability to change their own lives and possibly to change society. So that's a really important shift, I think, in the entire left-wing worldview. It shifted from the old revolutionary idea that people could come together and use their strength and their willpower and their intellect to create a better world. It shifted from that to a situation where it's constantly saying to people, you're a victim of transphobia, you're a victim of racism, you're a victim of the structural impact of history on the present. There's nothing much you can do about it apart from moan about it on Twitter. And that completely undermines people's ability to use their agency for good. So I think those are my two particular problems with identity politics. It's incredibly divisive, including racially divisive, and it encourages people to see themselves as pathetic rather than as the potential authors of a new future.
So on that point, something you've spoken about is what you see as the re-racialization of society, which we've kind of just touched on there, but could you go into some more detail about what you mean when you kind of call that out?
Yeah, I think identity politics has rehabilitated racial thinking. And in a sense, racial thinking never really went away. It's been around for a few hundred years. It takes different forms in different eras, but it always seems to lurk there. And sometimes it's very influential and other times it's not so influential, but it's always around. But I think over the past 50 years, humankind made some enormous gains in the battle against racial thinking, not only with the civil rights movement in the US and anti-racist movements in the UK, which I think did incredibly important work in terms of, well, in Martin Luther King's words, emphasizing character over color. That was really the ideal that those groups pushed forward. But also anti-colonial movements in the developing world, or the third world as it used to be called, the movements for national independence, the way in which radical revolutionary groups across Africa and also obviously in India and other parts of Asia asserted their right and their ability to govern their own affairs. All of these events over the past 50 plus years, longer than that, of course, in relation to India, they had an enormous impact in terms of breaking down the politics of race, calling into question the idea of white superiority, racial superiority, all those poisonous ideas that had been around for quite a long time, and moved us slowly but surely towards a situation where we started to understand that race is insignificant. It really does not matter what color someone is. The question is, what are they like as an individual? What is their character? What are they capable of? How can they contribute to society? That's really where we were heading towards. And that was great. And I think what the identitarian left has done, probably the most unforgivable thing they've done, has been to reverse all of those gains and create a situation where we are constantly told to think racially. To think about race all the time. You have workplaces and universities and even the political class going through unconscious bias training, teaching themselves to think about race constantly. My sins as a white person, how am I supposed to engage with a black person? How can I possibly understand their history? It creates this, it creates these barriers between different groups of people on the basis that these identity groups are polar opposites and will never really understand each other. And what they need are these well-paid experts to come into their workplaces and explain to them how they must relate to each other. So it's completely and utterly screwed up the progress that had been made over the past few decades, and given rise to this situation where, I mean, I meet young people all the time now who at universities, and sometimes even when I talk at schools, they are obsessed with race. They're obsessed with it. They talk about it all the time. And I think that is incredibly unhealthy. And so under the banner of wokeness or political correctness or a supposedly progressive politics, what these people have actually done is rehabilitated the racial imagination and created a society that is now myopically racial, and obsessed with skin color and the differences between people in a way that we haven't seen for 50 or 60 years.
And do you think that's likely to give rise to, well, I mean, I think you can kind of see it happening already, but do you think it's partly to blame for a rise in right-wing white ethnic politics to some extent?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the white nationalist stuff that we've seen in recent years, I think that's very much a reaction to it's. I think it's inspired by identity politics, and it's also a reaction to identity politics. So it's inspired by it because if you look at groups like, for example, if you look at Generation Identity in Europe, which is this racist group in Europe, pretty much a white nationalist movement, very hostile to the arrival of immigrant boats in the south of Europe. Katie Hopkins was kind of skirting around it for a while, you know, a really obnoxious organization. I mean, the very name of it, Generation Identity, tells you everything you need to know. This was a white identity movement. And I think we're seeing more of that, including in the US. So on one level, these groups are the logical extension of identity politics, because if everyone is simply a racial identity or a sexual identity or a group identity, then it makes perfect sense that white men would say, well, what about my identity? I'm going to set up my own group and I'm going to argue for my own race and the interests of my own race. So that was a perfectly predictable response to identity politics. I also think it's a reaction to and against identity politics at the same time, because one of the things that the identitarian left does, they've created a world in which we're supposed to see white men as the root of all evil, especially old white men. You know, it's amazing to me how white man has just become this incredibly dismissive, abusive term, which you don't hear whenever I see someone moaning about white men, I always, in my mind, I replace the words white men with black men in relation to what they've just said. And then you start to understand how problematic it is for them to push these views and how racist it is essentially to talk about entire groups of people in that way. So when you create a situation where you're constantly flagging up the evil nature of white men, the destructive nature of white men, the idea that everything bad in history is the consequence of white men and their privilege, some people are going to respond to that and lash out against it by saying, actually, white men are wonderful, and now we're going to set up a group to tell you how wonderful we are. So it's a defensive response as well to identity politics. But I think the argument I make in relation to the identitarian left is, look, you're playing with fire. You cannot stir up the racial imagination in the way that you have and then be surprised at the return of white nationalism. You just can't do that. Or if you are surprised, then you're an idiot, because this is such a predictable response to the whipping up of racial thinking that we've seen over the past few years.
So something else which stands out to me about this whole movement and way of thinking is that often some of the claims which they make or the assertions which are made, I think have some validity to them. I mean, like, you could agree or disagree on that. But so, for example, thinking about advantages which being white might afford you isn't something which I think there's no point thinking about in any way. It might be worth taking into consideration, but I don't think it can provide the degree of explanatory power which it's afforded by those people. And I think that's partly where my issues with some of that way of thinking lie. So taking, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen so many assertions that being a white man or being white give you various privileges, or that certain acts have been committed and can only be explained through the prism of racism, when in fact, those things might be worth taking into consideration, but there are also a whole number of other factors which need to be taken into account in order to actually understand the complexity of what's going on and the nature of society at present. And they seem to be pushed out of the discussion. So is that something which has stood out to you at all in the current debate?
Well, in relation to the white stuff, the way I see it is, if it's true that whiteness confers a certain advantage, I mean, I actually think that's less and less true, but let's say it was true. If that was true, why would that be the thing you talk about rather than talking about the disadvantage that Black people face? And this is the key problem I have with Black Lives Matter and other groups that focus on so-called white privilege. The problem with that whole language, the problem with that whole idea is that rather than focusing on the disadvantages that Black communities face, particularly in the US, where there is still a huge amount of racial disparity in relation to public life, education, work life, and so on, instead of talking about the disadvantages that Black communities face, there's this constant focus on the supposed advantages that white communities face. So it flips the discussion completely on its head. And it says the problem is that white people have privilege rather than the problem being that Black people have certain disadvantages. So it's a really weird way to understand the problem. It'd be like as if the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, as if all their marches were just against, horrible white men. Just think about how weird that would be. It would be such a strange approach to take when, of course, their marches were entirely focused on the rights and the freedoms of Black people and the importance of society recognizing those and institutionalizing them and making sure that there is no discrimination against Black people. So the very fact that it flips the story on its head and talks about white advantage rather than Black disadvantage, I think is incredibly interesting and very, very, very divisive, because what that does is it says the problem is white people. The problem is all these white people going around living lovely lives, which, by the way, most white people don't. And we should really not like these people. We should view them in a hostile way, rather than saying the problem is a social system which, for various historical reasons, in the United States context, I think Britain is very different, but which for various historical reasons hasn't achieved full equality yet between different racial groups. So that's my first problem with the white privilege narrative. My second problem, and I've written about this before, is just its complete ignorance of class and the importance of class. And this is another way in which I think identity politics, I don't see identity politics as being meaningfully left-wing at all. I'm always surprised because I think actually identity politics is very neoliberal in my view, which I think is why huge corporations have embraced it so feverishly and are employing racial experts to come into their workplaces and to reprimand the workforce, essentially, and to tell white workers how to think and how to speak and how to behave. I think there's a reason why the capitalist elites, particularly in Silicon Valley, but even more widespread than that, I think there's a reason they love identity politics, because they recognize instinctively that it's a useful form of divide and rule. It's a useful mechanism through which they can control and reprimand their workforce and the population more broadly. But the problem with white privilege as an idea is that it ignores the class factor, ignores what I consider to be the most important identity in society, which is class, your social relations, the question of whether you purchase people's labor or sell your labor, all those things that the left used to talk about and they don't talk about anymore. So when people talk about white men, who are they talking about? Are they talking about billionaires who employ and exploit thousands and thousands of people? Or are they talking about the white man from Poland who cleans their toilet while they're writing their articles for The Guardian? That's the question in my mind. Who are you talking about? And as soon as you lump together an entire group of people on the basis of the accident of their race, you completely erase questions of class differences, social differences, which I think are still the most important questions in society. So it's a very anti-progressive, regressive way of looking at the problems in society.
Do you not also think there's just a huge oversimplification, which I think is quite cynical in many ways, when it comes to explaining events through that prism. So taking, for example, the protests at the killing of George Floyd, you had countless celebrities and academics and journalists and politicians coming out and asserting things like, to take one quote, Black people are being slaughtered in the streets. That's something which was repeated over and over. And if you actually take a thorough look at the statistics behind it, which I did on a recent podcast with Wilfred Riley, who I know you know from Spiked, it's not as in any way as clear cut as it's being presented. Because anyone who just saw the clip, the horrible clip of the killing of George Floyd out of context, and then was told Black people are being slaughtered in the streets and was given no wider context, would understandably be absolutely furious. But it's the oversimplification. It's the willingness not to mention very similar killings of white people by the police, or the fact that some of the interactions between police and different communities have like complexities which go beyond purely racism on the behalf of individual officers. And that's just shoved out the equation in the discussion and makes things unbelievably polarized. And I think that's kind of at the absolute heart of the whole discussion. It seems to be missed by so many people who are taking part in it.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think what's happened is that the killing of George Floyd has been folded into a pre-existing narrative, a narrative that existed prior to that killing. Everyone agrees that killing was horrendous. People who've seen, you know, the idea that this killing is reflective of white attitudes to Black people is a complete fantasy. I have not met a single person or encountered a single person online who thinks that what was done to George Floyd was acceptable. That's completely, that's a given as far as I'm concerned. But what happened after the killing is that relatively rare incident, it's still rare that something as graphic and horrific as that happens, was folded into a pre-existing narrative of white privilege and Black oppression, of America being this kind of sinful racist nation, which is founded in slavery and founded in racism and has not yet recovered from that experience. It was folded into those narratives. It was folded into a narrative of police slaughtering Black people, which is just not sustainable when you look at the statistics, as you say. Huge numbers of Black people are not being killed in the streets. This is still a rare phenomenon. And then it was even folded into the narrative in the UK about police brutality against Black people. And the UK is completely different to the US. You know, I would say that the UK it does not have a significant problem with racism anymore. And we've made huge advances. But what happened is, the great irony of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it presents itself as this kind of radical, edgy movement. But I think it is American capitalism's most successful export, because it has spread across the world like an imperial juggernaut, and it has conquered every local issue and local political concern everywhere it's gone. So it completely took over the UK for weeks on end. We had our political class literally bowing down before it. You know, here comes the imperial diktats from America about how we have to understand race, and our politicians are bowing down. It was very influential in Europe, in Germany, in Australia. The campaign for Aboriginal rights, which I think is a very important campaign, even that was sucked up by Black Lives Matter and is now being done under the banner of Black Lives Matter. It was just this unstoppable imperial machine, which has become dominant, you know, via celebrities, woke corporations, the political elites and the media elites. They have promoted and pushed Black Lives Matter so that it's become this incredible global force which you're not really allowed to criticize. As we saw with Dominic Raab, when Dominic Raab said he wouldn't take the knee to Black Lives Matter, it caused a huge fuss. You know, what they're essentially saying is, how dare you refuse to bow down to identity politics? So it's created a very unquestioning, very conformist climate. But you're absolutely right. Questions have to be asked. And one of the questions that has to be asked is, are American police really as racist as we're told they are? No. Is America really this horrendously racist country still scarred by slavery? I would say no. I think these are caricatures. And the way in which the killing of George Floyd very quickly gave rise to this hysteria against statues, and this hysteria about American history, and this hysteria about the shadow of empire and the shadow of slavery, as if these things were still around and still impacting on us today. The fact that that all sprung from a brutal but random killing in Minneapolis tells you everything you need to know, because this was no longer about George Floyd. This was about a political movement that was calling into question the gains of the past 300 or 400 years, calling into question the virtues of the American Republic, and calling into question Enlightenment values themselves. And I think that's what we've seen off the back of the George Floyd killing.
Yeah, and just to kind of emphasize what the point I was trying to make earlier, when I say that it's statistically and kind of factually inaccurate, I think it's still possible to have sympathy with some of the claims made and some of the points being made by members of the movement or members of the Black community who feel like they're experiencing disadvantage or oppression, which is not in their imagination. It might be structured in some ways, but on a statistical level, if you look at the number of people killed by police in interactions on a kind of racial basis, there is a slight skewing towards Black people being more likely to be killed in the US by police. But then when you take into account factors like the circumstances in which they interact with the police, or whether a violent crime is being committed, actually it levels out. And most of the studies show, like one famous study by Fryer, who is a Harvard economist, I think, found that actually there is no real disparity in terms of police killings. If you just take a neutral view of it, surely you want to actually statistically get your analysis accurate. And that seems to be missing from so much of the discussion. It's similar with the reporting of the circumstances of different people's deaths. So Michael Brown, who, he famously, the hands up, don't shoot slogan came out of that one instance. It was reported that he was running away from the cops, that he had his hands up, he said, hands up, don't shoot. That went absolutely viral, was reported everywhere. Subsequently, it turned out that was actually not exactly what had happened. It sounds like he probably put his hands in the car, which the policeman was in, was trying to grab the gun. Now, none of that is justifying what happened or saying that these things aren't terrible. But surely, if you're just taking a neutral perspective, you want to be accurate in how you discuss it. And I think the impossibility of just having an accurate, factual discussion is really worrying.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's hostility to analysis at the moment. And that's really interesting. So anyone who talks about the statistics, anyone who digs down into them, and quite a few journalists in the US have done this, borrowing from studies done by academics, anyone who does that is immediately seen as suspect, immediately seen as racist, because what they're doing is they're calling into question the victim narrative that is propelling this movement and which is propelling regressive identity politics more broadly. Now, the problem is that as soon as you raise these questions, as you indicate, there's a risk that people will say, oh, you don't care about George Floyd, or you don't care about those people who've been killed, or you don't care about the fact that some American cops are still are probably racist or are trigger happy, to be sure. And that's inaccurate. You can be incredibly concerned about those problems. I'm incredibly concerned about the militarization of the American police. I think it's really shocking, the fact that they essentially have tanks and guns. And when I've been to the US a large number of times, and I'm always shocked to see cops walking around with guns, and it's quite unnerving. And for someone from the UK, where we very rarely see police with guns. So you can be concerned about all of that and the authoritarian implications of it, and the way in which certain communities are policed more harshly than other communities. All of those things are really important things for us to talk about. It's also important for us to talk about where there is still racial disparities in the US, where there are certain areas in public life or educational life where Black people are not doing as well as they should. Absolutely. Those are issues to be talked about, and solutions should be found to them. But I think the current movement and the current hysteria actually makes it harder to do that, because it's not geared towards having a reasoned, accurate discussion of the problems some communities face. Far less is it geared towards coming up with political solutions to those problems. Instead, it's geared towards this just being this kind of vast, fact-free story of victimhood and suffering, which people get a moral kick from being involved in. And you know, where white people play the role of the baddies and black people play the role of the victims. And it's become this sweeping global narrative. And it completely grates against any sense of sitting down, looking at the facts and having a proper discussion. So I would say my argument to Black Lives Matter is, you know, undoubtedly there will be some people involved in the Black Lives Matter movement who are concerned very much about the militarization of the police, the absolutely bizarre prison system in the United States, the faults of the criminal justice system, and lingering racial disparities. I'm sure they're genuinely concerned with those issues, but I would say you have to disconnect yourself from the myopically identitarian movement that has emerged over the past few years. You have to disconnect yourself from that before you can actually talk about those problems, because the identitarian movement has become this ridiculous virtue signaling outfit, which doesn't help us at all when it comes to tackling real social problems.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what you just said. In particular, I find, I want to move on quickly, but I do think there's something really depressing in a way about trying to make the arguments which just point out the factual realities, or try to at least make things based in fact rather than an almost religious, kind of dogmatic approach to these discussions. Because as I kind of think of myself as quite progressive, and I really would like hate and oppose all racism, but it's really disconcerting that even if I've got sympathy with a lot of the points which were being raised, like you point out, the hyper aggressive nature of policing, or the economic disadvantage faced by the disadvantages faced by the Black community, I want to base the discussion in accurate factual analysis as much as possible. And just trying to make that possible, you're met with so much vitriol, and it's treated as bad as if it's as bad as being actually racist itself, which I think is that's what kind of what I wanted to segue into, is the shifting of language and the way in which language, I think, is used so cynically around these discussions to shield proper debate and analysis. So to take one example, for example, violence. Violence is something which most people would agree is unacceptable in the political sphere. But with the rise of this particular form of identity politics, things which are areas of discussion and contestation are increasingly labeled as themselves violent. So it's not just real violence, which is violence. It's now discussion of complex issues, which is increasingly deemed violent. And once it's deemed violence, that legitimates the use of actual violence in response to not violence, basically just raising questions about something. And I find that really nefarious. It's the same with the term racism. It's used now to refer to questioning aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement. But that's completely different. Maybe I'm wrong to do that, but that doesn't mean that I believe racist stuff. It just means that I question a particular narrative. So what's your kind of view on the way that the language has been used by this?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important topics of our time, the question of language and how it's used in an incredibly dishonest way, often to shut people down or to demonize people as being beyond the pale and not worthy of listening to, or not worthy of giving a platform to. Language has been deployed by contemporary movements just to silence and shame people. And that's always a bad thing. So if you look at the discussion of violence, as you say, it's got to a really bizarre level at the moment, where we are told that certain words are violence. Silence is violence, by which they mean if you don't nod along to everything Black Lives Matter says, you're racist, you're violent. So silence is violence. But then apparently real violence is not always violence. So if you look at CNN saying that a mostly peaceful protest about something that was obviously violent and which was destructive primarily for working class and Black communities. But that apparently wasn't really violent. We've seen people defending looting. There's a book out called In Defense of Looting. Serious commentators in the US have said we've got to lay off looting. It's not as bad as we're making out. So you have this surreal situation where certain ideas or silence itself are seen as acts of violence, whereas acts of violence are constantly downplayed, especially by the mainstream media, who are, I think, very worried that if they criticize this stuff, they might benefit Trump or they might give Trump a boost. So they kind of hold back from benefiting the violence in the US over the past few months. But I think you're right to raise that problem of what happens when certain words and ideas are treated as a form of violence. What that does is that legitimizes violence in response to words. And that is, again, that is a fairly predictable thing. If you go around educating a new generation to think that any criticism of their identitarian worldview or of their political worldview is a form of violence, you are going to make them behave sometimes quite irrationally in response to criticism. And I've seen this on campuses. I did a talk at Oxford a couple of years ago, and someone was triggered, and I've never seen a real triggering before. And what happened is that this person had started to have a meltdown and became physically inconsolable and was having difficulty breathing. I'm not making any of this up, and had to be helped from the room. And what was most striking about that incident is that the other people, it was a small gathering listening to me do this kind of private talk. The other people were not particularly shocked by the response. And when I said, what just happened there? They said, oh, she's obviously been triggered by what you've said. Now, that's still a rare occurrence. You don't often see people have a nervous breakdown in response to words. But if we encourage people to see words as violent, you are going to make people feel incredibly fragile when they hear criticism. And the worst thing is, if you look at something like the massacre at Charlie Hebdo, that is arguably the logical extension of this idea. Because if you go around saying, for example, saying to Muslims that it's unacceptable for anyone to criticize your religion, if they criticize your religion, that's punching down, it's a form of racism, they're really humiliating you, they're really demonizing you, and it's completely unacceptable for people to criticize Islam. Of course, you're going to make people feel that criticism of Islam deserves some kind of punishment. Now, the punishment might be no platforming them from university, as happened to Maryam Namazi, the Iranian secularist who was no platform. Or it might mean losing your job. We saw that man at Asda, an ordinary working class granddad at Asda who lost his job because he shared a Billy Connolly video online which criticized Islam and other religions. Or take it to its extreme conclusion, and it could mean physically punishing someone, which is what the killers at Charlie Hebdo did. I've always seen that massacre as essentially the armed wing of political correctness, because what those two blokes were saying is, essentially, we're going to meet violence with violence, and your insults of Islam are so horrific and horrendous and demeaning that we are going to punish you in the highest way possible. That's the danger of censorship. People always say that the danger with freedom of speech is it could whip up poisonous sentiments and give rise to violence. I think censorship is more likely to give rise to violence, because if you encourage people to think that their belief system or their political ideas or their identity are beyond reproach and can never be criticized and are perfect and pristine, and any criticism of them is essentially blasphemy, that's more likely to cause violent situations. That's more likely to cause mob behavior. So I think censorship is a greater cause of at least violent attitudes than freedom of speech is.
Yeah, the Maryam Namazi example, which you mentioned, is actually just, that's quite a seminal moment for me in general, just because she's a left-wing Iranian secularist, and she'd come to Goldsmiths in the UK and a bunch of other universities to give a talk about basically why she's an atheist and why she opposes Islamism, which is currently the dominant regime in Iran, where I think she's from. And I think it was some super progressives, it's like the Feminist Society, the LGBTQ Society, and the Islamic Society, all basically ganged up and tried to no platform her, which in my view, as someone who tries to get past the groupthink and think about what I genuinely think is a moral way to think about stuff and a rational way to think about stuff, struck me as really irrational, because you've got the Feminist Society and the LGBTQ Society and the Islamic Society siding with Islamism, which is often deeply hostile to all those different modes of thought and groups. And just the intensity of the groupthink overrides actually rationally thinking, okay, the progressive person here, or the progressive approach to this, is to at least allow an Iranian feminist secularist to speak in the UK and not to side with theocrats, some of whom who were trying to shout her down really aggressively and said really kind of radical, really super homophobic stuff in public, and didn't face any consequences for it and weren't no platformed. But I think the discussion around radical Islam is just in particular another good example of where groupthink often overrides what should take precedence, which I think is what's best or the most rational way to discuss the issue. And that's something you've discussed quite a lot. So could you go into some detail about kind of how you see the left or the progressive approach to that issue and what its failings are?
Yeah, I just think the left today, and not just the radical left, but the mainstream left and even liberals, are incredibly reluctant to face up to the problem of radical Islam, and even reluctant to face up to the problem of violent Islam. They are incredibly cagey about having this discussion. It was really brought home to me when there was the Charlottesville, when the guy in Charlottesville drove his car into a bunch of protesters and one young woman died. A horrific act. Bunch of far-right lunatics who basically has attacked these left-wing protesters, and one woman was killed. It was horrendous. And that became this galvanizing moment for the left across the Western world. I mean, it became their reference point, and they said, this proves we have to stand up to fascism and violence. A few days later, in Barcelona, a radical Islamist drove a car down a busy street, and I think he killed 14 people, including a very, very young child. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Of course, it got loads of newspaper coverage. It was on the front pages. Of course, we were all encouraged to feel sad and to put the Spanish flag on our Facebook pages and all that stuff. There was no galvanizing moment. There was no discussion about the problem of Islamofascism, as one might refer to it. No discussion about needing to galvanize against these, galvanize ourselves against these forces, against these regressive forces, against this regressive violence. Nothing. And that double standard, I think, really cuts to the heart of the left's inability or unwillingness to talk about radical Islam, because they're obsessed with the far right and white supremacists, who I think, if you were talking earlier about looking at statistics and facts, the far right and white supremacists are less of a threat than radical Islamists. And that's just a fact. If you look at Europe, hundreds of people have been killed by radical Islamists in Europe over the past 5 or 6 years, hundreds. In Paris, in Nice, in Berlin, in Barcelona, in London, in Manchester. And it very rarely causes any kind of serious long-term discussion or reflection. And instead, what we have are people trying to brush it under the carpet. You know, don't focus on this too long, or don't look back in anger, as they said after the Manchester Arena bombing. You know, lay a flower, move on, shut the hell up. And anyone who does talk about it runs the risk of being called Islamophobic, divisive, racist, and so on. I would argue that I think that there are two things driving this unwillingness to talk about radical Islam. The first is just abject moral cowardice, and really a depraved form of moral cowardice in terms of an unwillingness to face up to the divisions in your own society, which have become so intense that there are people within your own society who are willing to blow up children, or are willing to mow down people celebrating Bastille Day in Nice. When that happens, there ought to be a very long, serious discussion about the problems in society, or the problems with certain forms of ideology that have taken hold. But this abject moral cowardice means they're just unwilling to do that, because they're unwilling to call into question anything to do with multiculturalism or anything to do with those kinds of phenomena. So the first thing is just a cowardice to face up to the problem. And the second thing is I think there's a racist component to it too, because it's often driven by this notion that Muslims, radical Muslims, aren't really in control of what they're doing, right? It's not really their fault. They're probably victims themselves. You know, they were led astray by someone on the internet, and they were taken down a dark path, and it's all horrible, but let's forget about it. They would never say that about a far-right terrorist. They would never say, oh, poor little far-right terrorist, he was led astray by someone on the internet, and he had his head filled with poisonous ideas, and he did this terrible thing, but let's not dwell on it. They do that in relation to radical Muslims because they have this tendency to infantilize Muslims and to see Muslims as a special group, a slightly pathetic group, a slightly weak group, who aren't 100% in control of their lives and who are in a very unfortunate position in society. I think there's a slightly racist element to that. My concern, I like living in a mixed society. I like living in a society that has people from different parts of the world people with different cultures. I think that's great. My parents are immigrants, so I'm a first generation Briton. My family's only been here for 50 years. We're complete newcomers. So that's great. That's wonderful. But we also have to ask how it's possible to have a society in which that can happen, but everyone feels part of society. Everyone feels that they belong. Everyone feels part of a kind of cohering culture or a cohering national story. And the failure to do that at the moment, and the preference for pushing a divisive politics of identity, I think that's one of the core problems we face. And it's really grating against the possibility of having a truly integrated society.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing a point you raised there is basically the bigotry of low expectations. That's the phrase which Magic Demas uses, which I have a lot of. I could definitely understand that point of view. So I think that there's definitely an element to which there's an aspect to the reluctance to call out radicalism, which is motivated by good intentions, which is a desire to prevent any form of backlash and not to paint the picture of all Muslims as evil, which is obviously a really racist point of view. And some people do fall foul of thinking in that way and expressing those views. So I can understand the desire to protect or like kind of shield groups from over like too much scrutiny or too much criticism where it's not warranted. But at the same time, it's, as you say, it's basically saying that the whole ideology itself is kind of can be generalized to all Muslims, and that by criticizing radical Islam, you might be being offensive to the vast majority of peaceful, non-violent Muslims in the country who actually have complete contempt for that worldview and are in no way violent. And I think there's definitely an aspect of just complete doublethink there. It's something else which stood out to me about that is the way in which kind of every time there's a really violent Islamist attack in the world across the West, it's basically met by a really weird reluctance to actually call out the ideology behind it, which is what you're mentioning. So it's like when Shamima Begum went to join ISIS, the vast majority of the left-wing commentary that I saw on that was quite sympathetic towards her, or basically painting her as the victim. I just think that the whole approach to me stands out as quite irrational.
Yeah, I think well, just briefly on your point about good intentions, you know what they say about the road to hell, and I think that's really true in this situation, because as you've just suggested, I think one of the key problems with being unwilling to criticize radical Islam is that it has a really detrimental impact on Muslim communities. Because Muslim communities are probably more keen than anyone else to get to grips with the problem of radical Islam. They don't want these radical young blokes at their mosques who might at some point go off and commit some horrendous crime. I'm sure they have an incredibly vested interest in making sure that this problem is addressed. A recent poll found that Muslims were more keen than other sections of society to report someone if they thought they were becoming radicalized. You know, they're very concerned about these problems. And I think the unwillingness to confront radical Islam on the basis that it might cause problems for the Muslim community is deeply, deeply patronizing. It's such a white middle class form of patronizing behavior. It really is up there with the worst forms of it. But also it does precisely what it's trying not to do. So it's trying not to tar all Muslims with the brush of being radical Islamists, which I think we absolutely should not do. But it ends up doing that because it says, you know, this lunatic who blew up 20 children at the Manchester Arena, we can't possibly focus on him too much because that might be offensive to ordinary Muslims. Ordinary Muslims who would never in a million years dream of blowing themselves up at Manchester Arena. So it actually is, they completely shoot themselves in the foot. And even worse, they do damage to the Muslim community by presenting them as almost as an infantile community that needs protection, but also one which at some level has something in common with the guy at Manchester Arena or the guy at London Bridge or the guy at Westminster Bridge. And that's such a dangerous argument.
Yeah, and it's also massively oversimplistic because obviously within the Muslim community themselves, there's vast divisions. There's all different forms of minority groups within that group, many of whom are often disagree with one another on all different aspects of the religion. And it's way more complicated than it's painted as. So for example, women's rights, often some women within that community might face certain issues which other members of other communities might not face. It's a really touchy, complicated subject to discuss and get to grips with. But just to dismiss any discussion of it whatsoever as basically bigoted, actually arguably is discriminating against or disadvantaging some of the most vulnerable members of that community itself. And I think there's just a kind of really worrying trend, although I do understand the impulse behind it. So moving on, I know we've got limited time left. So just to get to something more current, we've seen in the US, there's the kind of election cycle there, and we're running up to the election. What is your take on what's going on there? It's kind of hard to ask a concise question, but just generally, what's your take, a short one, on the state of the US and politics there more broadly?
It's not good at all. And I thought the first televised debate was just atrocious, really, really shockingly bad. And I watched it and I thought, is this really the best that the American Republic has got? These kind of two aging blokes shouting over each other, especially Trump, who was, I thought, gave an incredibly bad performance, or Biden, who very often can't string a sentence together, is often quite confused. Is this the best America has got? I thought it was such a depressing spectacle. I think what's going on in America at the moment is really interesting, because the election is taking place against the backdrop of some of the worst instability America has experienced for 50 years. And I think what we're witnessing is identity politics is now on the streets. I mean, it used to be restricted to universities and sometimes to workplaces. It's now on the streets. It's becoming more and more violent. We're seeing people, racial tensions are intensifying, but in an identitarian form. There's actual shootings. Huge areas have been burnt down. I still don't think the media has had an honest reckoning with how many American businesses and communities have been destroyed, very often working class and Black communities. So that's the backdrop. This is a country deeply, deeply divided by the culture wars. And I think whoever wins the election, those problems won't be sufficiently addressed. So I think that instability is going to linger on and explode at different times over the next 4 years. But in terms of the election itself, I think it's weird and strange, but I do think it's pretty clearly a battle between, on the one hand, the kind of populist loudmouth Donald Trump, who has virtually no media support and is loathed by the kind of old liberal establishment, but has this fairly strong base of ordinary people who want politics to go in a new direction and who are sick of the old liberal establishment. So you've got him on one side, and on the other side, you've got the great white hope of the technocratic elites, which is Joe Biden, who is pretty hopeless. So I think the weirdest thing in the US, from my point of view, is that both of these constituencies, on the one hand, you've got ordinary voters who want a more democratic and a renewed form of politics. And on the other side, you've got the kind of technocratic establishments who want to hold on to the old status quo. The problem is that both of those are represented by bad people. So Trump, I don't think, is a good representative for ordinary working voters who want America to change and improve. And Joe Biden is not a good representative for the technocratic elites who want to preserve the kind of neoliberal status quo that existed prior to Brexit and prior to Trump. So both sides are being let down. And until they get leaders who better reflect their differences of opinion, we won't really see that clash of opinions take place. And I think that's a real problem.
Okay, one final point. Do you not think that it's quite difficult to think straight about the nature of US politics, and also to some extent British politics at the moment, that especially in the US, because of the degree of intensity and what I perceive to be bias and groupthink against Trump? Because from my perspective, there are so many things I think warrant really serious criticism, which Trump does. But kind of, it's impossible to delineate between that and just the degree of news coming out every single day from almost every mainstream source, which is beyond just rational, serious, important scrutiny of what's being said and the policies being discussed. And it goes into basically almost hysterical, really propagandistic the kind of that realm. And I think it makes it hard to think straight, because I don't think that it's problematic to criticize Trump at all. But if you've got a media discussion which is so heavily weighted in that direction, I'm not sure how the average voter is going to be able to step back and actually make a sane decision almost.
Yeah, I agree. I refer to myself as anti-Trump. So I'm critical of Trump. There's lots of his policies that I don't support. But I think the anti-Trump movement of the past 4 years has just been completely nuts. I think they have exaggerated how awful he is. I think they've exaggerated how evil he is. I think all that stuff 4 years ago about Trump being literally Hitler, and we had people marching in the streets of London with pictures of Trump looking like Hitler. There was loads of serious commentary comparing him to Hitler and talking about the 1930s. I thought that was completely deranged. I thought there were two problems with it. The first is that it completely exaggerated the problem of Trump. He's nothing like Hitler whatsoever, and America has not become a fascist state. And it also engaged in historical relativism. So it kind of normalized the 1930s, and it normalized the Nazi experience as if that was just another blip in history rather than the worst crime in history. So it screwed up our understanding of history, and it screwed up our understanding of the present and politics in the present. But the thing is, I'm fascinated by Trump because I disagree with him on a lot, but I find the depiction of him in the media to be just completely fake. And if you look, for example, he's done about 2 or 3 speeches over the past few months, which I think have been absolutely brilliant speeches. He did one on critical race theory. He did one on cancel culture. He's talked about the importance of the American Revolution and the fight for freedom and Enlightenment values, essentially. They were badly delivered, but they were brilliantly written. So there's someone on Trump's team, I think, who understands the cultural and political tensions in society and has largely come down on the right side of them. Pro-freedom, anti-identity politics, pro-Martin Luther King, who Trump quoted in a recent speech. These are really interesting developments, I think, and they can't just be brushed aside. But I think the most striking thing about Trump is that he's unique among Western politicians in the sense that he speaks directly to his base. And he's got no choice but to speak directly to his base because the media absolutely hates him. The only platform he's got is Twitter and his rallies, essentially. And he has to go directly to the populace because he can't go through all the normal filters, because the normal filters call him Hitler and a fascist and everything else. So that's a really interesting and striking development, I think, in Western politics. And we might see more of that, where politicians, because of the hostility of the media, are forced to engage much more directly and democratically with ordinary people. So if that proves to be successful in this election, if Trump wins again, largely on the basis that he spoke directly to ordinary people and said, listen, trust me for another 4 years, that I think will be a radical transition in Western politics more broadly.
Okay, Brendan, I don't want to keep you because I know you need to go, but thanks so much for coming on the E2 Review podcast. Yeah, it's been great to have you on.
Thanks,
where can people find you?
On Spiked. Find me at spiked-online.com every day, and on the Brendan O'Neill Show podcast. And I'm on Instagram.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot, and you're welcome back whenever you want.
Cheers, Max.